apologize for any extraneous noise. I hope it doesn't distract you too much. Now, the Tallano fraud consists of two claims. First is that there was a royal clan that owns the whole of the Philippines, the entire archipelago, except for one significant province. The other part of the claim is that this clan owns hundreds of thousands of tons of gold, many times more than has ever been mined in human history. I'm going to deal with the first one. That a royal clan owns the whole of the Philippines. Now, this claim has appeared on Facebook, YouTube, and it's referred to in this fake news item about Nonoy Aquino supposedly sending 3,500 tons of gold to Thailand. Now, the claim has never been formally addressed by historians, and while it's been widely debunked, there's been very little actual basis other than saying, well, there was no such place as a kingdom of Maharlika. But let's suppose that somewhere in all those thousands of Spanish folios, as yet unread, there is some reference to it. After all, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Now, these claims are backed up by an enormous wodge of documents and sheets of paper that appear to have been knocked up on a Microsoft Word on a PC. But they all depend upon one key document known as OCT 1-04, supposedly signed on the 17th of January 1764 between Dawson Drake, who was governing Manila on behalf of the East India Company, and Jose Raon, the Spanish governor, and it was witnessed by George III. Already you can see there's problems. So I secured a copy of a translation of this document. The Tallanos have never once presented an original document in Spanish. They've never presented to the courts a document, an original document at all. And indeed, this particular document has only been made available to the court in a supposed translation. And that translation has an annotation that says it was hardly readable. So how can we be sure that that translation is actually correct? Already we're running into problems. If we can show that this document is a fraud, then all the other documents necessarily collapse. And one of the reasons why I think this document can be a useful tool in teaching a bit more skepticism, a little bit more critical thinking, is that it is flooded with basic errors that prove that it is a forgery, that it is a hoax. More than that, it's probably hoaxed in the 1980s by somebody who was learning history in the 1960s or 70s. And I believe also that this document shows a direct link to President Ferdinand Marcos, because these claims, the Tallano claims, are used to justify the immense wealth of President Ferdinand Marcos. Let's take a look at some of the document, or this particular document, which has never been examined by a historian familiar with the period, never been given to a forensic document examiner to verify. So let's start with the very first words right at the top of the page. The Royal Crown of England. Well, I happen to be British, and I'm here to tell you that that is a form of words that is not used on a document. It is always either the Crown, as in the Crown Estates, the Crown Court, and indeed in legal cases where the state is prosecuting somebody, it is the Crown versus whoever. Royal is used alone when, for instance, we talk about the Royal Mint, and that's just one example, or the Royal Mail. So already there's a problem. To add to that, it wasn't the Royal Crown of England. It was, at the time, in 1764, George III was King of Great Britain and Ireland. Now let's move to the opening bits of this document. Again, it makes the same error about the Royal Crown of England. In fact, it says the Royal Government. This again is wrong. It would be His Majesty's Government. So the whole form of words has not been written by anybody familiar with British protocol, and certainly George III and Dawson Drake would have been aware of the protocols. Let's go to the very first opening segment. It mentions the Torrens Title, the Torrens system. But in 1764 there was no Torrens system. Robert Torrens wasn't born until the mid-19th century. Robert Torrens was an Australian politician who developed a system called Torrens Titles that wasn't introduced to the Philippines until the 20th century. So there again, we've got an anachronism. How can a document of 1764 refer to something that didn't exist until over 100 years later? Now, if we move through this document, we discover a Princess Overbeck. There was no Overbeck in the Philippines in 1764, nor was there a MacLeod. These are the names of MacLeod, who was a British trader in the 18th century, and Overbeck, who was not a royal, but involved in the lease of Sabah from the Sultan of Sulu. He was not royal. He was later made a baron, but that doesn't make him royal. So how does his offspring be a princess? Now let's move into some of the parts of the Philippines that this document says the Tallano's own. You'll see here that it includes Ilocos Sur, but not Ilocos Norte. Why not? These were both formed in the 19th century by the splitting up of the Ilocos, nearly 100 years after this document was signed. And where's Ilocos Norte? Why doesn't it include Ilocos Norte? Who's famous for being in Ilocos Norte? Now, the other things that show that this is a fraud is the reference to hectares and kilometers. The metric system was not in use in 1764. Again, it wasn't even used in Spain until the 19th century. We have a problem with that too. And there are many, many other examples that show beyond anything that can be called reasonable doubt that this is a fraud. including the claim that it was witnessed by George III. Well, how did he witness it? He never went to Manila. He never went to the Philippines. And it was signed by Jose Raon. At that time, Jose Raon was governor of Panama. He was nowhere near the Philippines. How could he sign it? In fact, the first new Spanish governor to be appointed was Torres, who was a man who arrived with the orders for Dawson Drake to evacuate Manila on behalf of the British government.